Coming up on Chopper's Politics, ho, ho, ho.
It speaks to an attitude of those who were designing and implementing laws to regard them deeply cynically. You know, the British public aren't fools, and that's why there's been the reaction.
A tumultuous political landscape, a lot of asses, not enough wise men, and a newborn babe. I'm Christopher Hope, also known as Chopper, the chief political correspondent at the Daily Telegraph, and this is Chopper's Politics. And no, I'm not talking about the nativity, but the scene at number 10 this week, as Boris Johnson welcomes a baby daughter into the world and has to deal with the backlash of Plan B and the fallout from a Christmas party that may or may not have happened this time last year.
I've seen reports on Twitter that there was a Downing Street Christmas party on Friday night. Do you recognise those reports?
I went home.
Well, there's a lot to discuss on this podcast, so grab your cheese and wine and we'll get started. Tory rebellion over the new pandemic rules is brewing. MPs say they can't vote for just-in-case restrictions. And Sajid Javid, the Health Secretary, was heckled by his own backbenchers in the House of Commons on Wednesday, when he confirmed new restrictions would include a return to working from home from this Monday and vaccine passports for large events from next Wednesday. And one of those letting Mr Javid know exactly how they feel about the move to Plan B in England was William Wragg, MP for Hazel Grove in Greater Manchester and a senior MP as the chairman of a select committee in the House of Commons.
We will be introducing mandatory certification based on vaccines or tests in nightclubs and large events. This will reduce the number of unvaccinated infectious people in venues, which could limit overall transmission.
William Wragg, welcome to Chopper's Politics. How are you?
I'm very well, Chris. How are you?
Good. You were letting off steam, weren't you, Wednesday night?
One way to put it.
Yeah. Why did you shout at Sajid Javid to resign in the House of Commons? Because
I'm so implacably opposed to COVID vaccine passports and assumed the government were as well.
Well, it seems that they are looking at it, doesn't it? It's quite a big thing. You're a senior Tory MP. You're the chairman of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee. You sit on the liaison committee. You're a senior parliamentarian, and it's a big moment, I think, for you as a person to shout resign at the Health Secretary.
I think people are only described as senior when they do something controversial. I'm always mindful of that because it sort of beefs up the importance of it when actually it's just a single member of Parliament expressing his frustration in with one word. But yes, I accept the premise of your question.
You're not alone. You say you're a single MP. There's a lot of MPs concerned about vaccine passports on the backbenches, aren't there?
Yeah, because there's absolutely no evidence to show that they work. And whenever ministers are asked for it, they either can't produce it or say it's very complicated. But it all boils down to the fact that they are useless at best and at worst utterly divisive and discriminatory.
Don't it give a degree of comfort for people to know that the person you're speaking to has been double or triple jabbed?
Yes, but as we've seen with more recent variants, and particularly the latest one, it does nothing or very little now to stop transmission. And so the purpose of the vaccine is very much for the individual to be afforded the protection themselves. And I absolutely support people having the vaccination. They should be absolutely encouraged to do so, as I have done and as I've said to all my constituents, urging them to get vaccinated and to get the booster completely. But if you look at the utility or apparent utility, or indeed lack of utility of what is proposed, it's mind-boggling.
You and me talking, no one's listening to this anyway. How big will the rebellion be next week when they're voted on Tuesday?
Not big enough, in my opinion. But
40, 50, 60, 100?
I've no idea.
If you were putting your finger in the wind?
Finger in the wind, I can only speak for myself, so at least one.
And as many as 60 or so? I mean, it does seem...
I never over-egg the size of a rebellion. If, from whatever perspective, whether it's the government whips or those who are rebelling, the numbers are played very carefully.
Last night, Greg Smith, a colleague of yours, said he thought that some junior ministers and parliamentary private secretaries might rebel next week. And that means resignation time, doesn't it?
Well, it would do. It would do. And I really would urge the government at this late stage not to put them in that position.
Do you think it might happen?
Well, if they have the courage of their convictions, then yes, it will.
You tweeted late last night, maybe after midnight, your conversation with Nadine Dorries, didn't you? You said that she was haranguing you in the tea room. I mean, she's a former public health minister, so maybe that's why she felt able to talk to you about this. Now she's culture secretary. Quite,
but I think ministers should stick to trying to convince colleagues on matters under their own portfolio. That's how it usually works.
What did she say to you?
Listen, I'm not going to go into anything else than I've said, and I wouldn't have done so if it had happened in a private conversation. But given that it happened across separate tables at breakfast time, and my general frustration, having then read the leaked reports of the cabinet, it's an expression of that frustration that I felt inclined to do so.
Was it done for others to hear, you think, when she spoke to you in public like that?
Presumably. And that's not the way to go about things if you're Secretary of State.
Mandatory jabs being looked at, aren't they, as well? Now, that's something else. We haven't even got to that conversation yet.
Allegedly. And I just wonder what the end point of all this is, particularly for a Conservative government that claims to be a Conservative government, certainly.
Well, today, Sajid Javid, Thursday morning, said that he thought it referred to health workers rather than generally. But the idea of holding people down and jabbing their arms is obviously hard to understand why a Tory government, or any government, would do that.
It's absolutely ridiculous. Listen, you encourage people to take the vaccine. You explain the benefits of having the vaccine. You publicise the data that shows the vast majority of those in hospital with COVID at the moment are unvaccinated. That is persuasive enough. Ultimately, surely one of the tenets that we hold dear is having that personal autonomy over medical procedures. And I want people to be vaccinated. I want everybody who is eligible and capable to come forward and to receive it. But what I'm not in favour of is compelling people to do so, because that fundamentally changes the relationship between the state and the individual.
What is happening, do you think, to Boris Johnson? Why has he gone this degree of authoritarianism, which he would never have countenanced when he worked for Telegraph? Mandatory jabs, vaccine passports, these aren't, I would say, conservative things to do.
Well, they're not conservative things to do. So, I mean, really, you'd have to put the question to him, but it's so out of character from the Boris Johnson I thought I knew, the great writer of columns for your esteemed publication. I can imagine in that position exactly what he would be writing. So I can't fathom it.
It also seems to go against the government policy of living with COVID. I mean, there is no evidence of hospitalisations yet in the UK. The figures last night seem to compare South Africa with the UK. Now, we don't know what the vaccination record is like in South Africa. We have a good record in this country. They're using data which is not really comparing apples with apples. Am I wrong in saying that?
No, I don't think so. I think if you look at the rate of vaccination in South Africa, it's much lower. Now, I accept what the Health Secretary said, of course, about the demographics and the age profile thereof, but it's not comparing readily comparable data, if I can put it that way. And, you know, I think, and Greg Clark, my colleague, hit the nail on the head. He was assured previously by the Health Secretary that they would look at the rate of hospitalisations, not the rate of cases. I thought that's where we've moved to. And I think he put it very well yesterday in question to the Health Secretary that the Health Secretary has jumped the gun. The government has jumped the gun.
Now, why is this? Well, I mean, some critics are saying it's a dead cat. Is to, if that in layman's terms, that means to distract from the other problems the government's got at the moment. Is that the case, or why are they cowering in front of this virus and not learning to live with it as an understandable and understood enemy?
I don't know, and I think this is the root of my frustration. I'd like to say, and I'm sure many people will disagree with me, that I can be quite a rational-minded person. But at the moment, my apparent irrationality is a reaction to the nonsense that's put before me. And I think I can speak for a fair few colleagues similarly.
Have you talked to Nadine Dorries or Boris Johnson or Sajid Javid in the past few hours, or have they kept away from you?
No, I suspect they've kept away from me. But it's a great shame to have to resort to this sort of megaphone internal politics. But I'm afraid people only do that when they're not being listened to.
There was a wider problem here. I've heard talk this week of 2 Tory MPs saying in a meeting they're going to thinking about putting no confidence letters in about Boris Johnson. We know the whips are concerned about that. What's going on in the Tory party? This guy was elected with a landslide just over 2 years ago.
Look, with my position on the 1922 committee, I'd never enter a conversation about letters. I'm sorry to disappoint, but let me cut the government some slack. They have got a very difficult job. But what is required is for us to approach the coming out of the pandemic, adapting where necessary, of course, but at least doing that in a way that we can say is a conservative way, which actually trusts people, has regard for the economy from which all the public services are funded, and indeed reaches that mythical state of living with COVID.
Will the public pay much attention to these measures, given the row about so-called Partygate and whether or not there's a party or several parties in and around Number 10 last Christmas? I mean, how damaging do you find those?
Well, I think they are, because it speaks to an attitude of those who were designing and implementing laws which by and large I didn't vote for, but that's quite beside the point, but then appearing to regard them deeply cynically. And, the British public aren't fools, and that's why there's been the reaction.
And they've been taken for fools by Number 10. I mean, that video showed everyone laughing about these rules that they imposed on us,
Well, the video would suggest that, wouldn't it? And that's why there's such reaction among the public, and I dare say among a fair few colleagues.
Yeah. These plans we think are going to be in force until January the 30th, the end of next month. They'll be reviewed, I think, in early January. You might know more than I do about that. So we're looking at work from home for another 6 weeks, mask wearing, vaccine passports.
Yeah. Well, there's some things in that at a practical level, the working from home. We're trying to revive our city and town centres. We're trying to revive those hospitality venues. The issues around, that you go onto vaccine passports strikes at the heart and against what it is, in my view, to be a conservative. So these are big things, but they have wider impacts than rattling fuddy-duddies like me, particularly with reference to the economy.
Where to end then? I mean, I think there'll be a futile gesture next week, won't there, when a lot of Tory MPs vote against the plans. With Labour support, they'll get through.
Well, you have all the socialists in one lobby, and you'll have all the conservatives in the other.
William Wragg, what a time we live in. Thanks for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Great to have you on.
As ever, a pleasure.
Now, for more details on how the new restrictions might affect you, as well as some, shall we say, passionate comment pieces from our brilliant writers at Telegraph, want to become a Telegraph subscriber? Just go to telegraph.co.uk/chopper to get your first month completely free of charge, and then full access to all of our top journalism. Right, stay with us. Up next, I'm talking to Jake Berry, one of Boris Johnson's original 3 friends in the Tory party about 3 years ago, about the court of public opinion and whether the PM needs an Alastair Campbell figure in Number 10. Right after this.
We're interrupting this podcast to bring you news of another Telegraph show we think you might like. It's called Planet Normal, and it's hosted by me, Liam Halligan.
And me, Alison Pearson. We're both Telegraph columnists who share the view that far too often those who shout the loudest on the telly just don't represent the views of normal people.
So take a trip with us to Planet Normal. We're joined by some stellar guests, well-known voices from politics, business and the arts.
All from different fields, but they have one thing in common. They're at the top of their game, but distinctly down to earth. The good news is I finally learnt what a podcast is and even how you subscribe to it. It's actually quite simple. Search for Planet Normal on your podcast app or click on the link in the show notes for this episode.
You don't really know what a podcast is, do you?
I am one. Look, I am one. Who needs to know what it is? I am one, okay? Shut up.
Now, I don't know about you, listeners, but sometimes I wonder what it might be like to be Prime Minister. What legislation I would bring in and which curtains I might install in my big flat. But if I were the PM this week, my tenureship would involve a lot of hiding under the duvet and hoping it all blows over. So what better time to talk to Jake Berry, the Tory MP for Rossendale and Darwen, spokesman for the Red Wallers as chairman of the Northern Research Group of Tory MPs, and one of Boris Johnson's oldest friends on the Conservative backbenchers, about how his old pal is faring in a week where absolutely none of us, I'm pretty sure, would fancy the top job. Jake Berry, Tory MP, welcome to Choppers Politics. How are you?
I'm really well, Chris. Lovely to speak to you.
Good. And how is your friend Boris Johnson doing?
Well, I think he's in celebratory mood. I want to be one of the first to put on record my congratulations to him and his wife about the birth of their beautiful daughter. I would have thought that's a bright star in an otherwise slightly dark sky for him at the moment.
It's certainly a dramatic punctuation mark in a difficult week for the PM. Now, you've known him for a long time. 3 years ago, when he had very few friends in politics, you were there with him, weren't you, plotting how to get him back into politics after he quit as Foreign Secretary over Theresa May's Brexit deal. What's your advice to him if it was you and him now on the phone?
Well, my advice is keep going. I think we all have really difficult periods in politics. He's clearly well beyond the end of his second honeymoon that came with a hugely successful vaccine rollout. But he does need, and the government does need, to start to communicate better with backbench members of Parliament. They need to level up the Downing Street operation, as one may say, and just get a bit slicker and a bit better. Boris is absolutely still the right person to run this country and to lead us to a brighter future. But he just needs a stronger team to help him deliver it. OK,
let's look at those two ideas. The levelling up his team around him. He did very well, didn't he, as London Mayor, because he had a very good team of deputy mayors around him who made him look good and could deliver on what he wanted. Why has he not got that this time? He seems quite isolated. There's no one who can walk in there and tell him what to do, are there? They're all kind of staff members around him rather than grown-ups.
You may say that, but look, let's be absolutely clear. Policy without implementation is just hallucination. And, you can talk about all the great things you're going to do, but unless you have a sort of crack team of grizzled and wizened enforcers, then you're not going to make much progress. And Boris is the great man for the ideas and also great man for inspiring people. But in fact, as Prime Minister, you need to make sure that your ministerial cadre and your team around you, number 10, is focused on delivery. And I'm just not sure we just quite have that at the moment, but it's all completely fixable.
Is it, though? Because we're seeing his standing in the opinion polls sink. There were issues about how he is, why he couldn't come clean about this party amongst more junior staff in number 10 earlier, if there were one. Does he need somebody in there who can just tell him, come on, Boris, this is what you need to do to get around this next hurdle?
Yes, absolutely. That's exactly the sort of support that he needs. Let's be really clear about these parties. I accept the Prime Minister's word that he's been reassured that no rules were broken. I've got no reason to doubt him. But actually, ultimately, the people around him who are attending these parties, it's a question of judgment, isn't it? It's not whether it was within the rules, it's whether it's sort of within the court of public opinion deemed as acceptable. And I just think those sort of high-level conversations, almost a sort of Alastair Campbell figure, feared and revered across the Downing Street estate and government, is the right sort of person, somebody who can, crunch a few browns and knock a few heads.
And the current person there, Dan Rosenfeld, the Chief of Staff, isn't that person?
No, Dan Rosenfeld is a fine individual with many fine characteristics, but he needs a stronger team to work with.
Margaret Thatcher had a Willie White law, and she always said that every Prime Minister needs a Willie. Does Boris need a Willie?
Thanks, Chris. No, I think he's demonstrated that he certainly has one. But he does need a fixer. And, let's hope that happens shortly. And that, he is definitely, when facts change, people sometimes change their minds. I don't really think the facts have changed. I still think he's the best man to lead our country. These are very difficult times, but he is absolutely the person to pull us through them.
Is that view shared, though, by some of your colleagues on the Tory backbenches, maybe notably Red Wall seats, who won seats from Labour MPs in 2019 and are keenly aware of the need to have a competent government to hold that seat against what might be a resurgent Labour Party at the next election. Are they worried?
Well, they are worried. People are getting concerned. We're probably in day 40, I think, or something like that, of it feels like half a lifetime, of sort of, being battered in the press and in Parliament. Quite rightly they're worried, but what I would say to them is stick to your mettle. We've been through worse than this before. We will come out of it stronger. The strongest steel is obviously forged in the fire. For many of them, this is the first sort of political difficult times they've been through. But I know I'm not the most experienced MP in Parliament. I've been around a while. And I know that, we will come through this if we stick together, and that's what I'd call on them to do.
Have you heard of any letters going in to Sir Graham Brady, the chairman of the 1922 committee?
There's always rumours of letters going here, there and everywhere. I don't know of one person who sent one. I certainly haven't. And, what I would say, if people are listening to this, it would be the biggest act of political suicide and insanity I've witnessed in my time in Parliament for people to start saying we need a leadership election. It's absurd. It shouldn't happen. We need to get behind Boris.
The success of the Tory party, of course, is over the past 11 years is they have jettisoned leaders who are out of step with the time. David Cameron quit when he lost the Euro election. Theresa May quit over Brexit. Will the same happen to Boris Johnson? They may find, well, he was the right person for Brexit. He was the right person to win an election from 2019 when it was against a weak candidate called Jeremy Corbyn. But times have changed, and perhaps that a new leader is required to take on those challenges.
Well, I think what hasn't changed is the fact that the people of the North, particularly across that red wall, bought into Boris's compelling vision for levelling up. He needs to rapidly move on from being the crisis COVID Prime Minister, which understandably he's been for the last 2 years, and move on to that levelling up agenda. I kind of welcome the fact that the levelling up white paper was delayed, because we can't know what we don't know, but obviously this week or next week would not be the week to be outlining our plan for Britain anyway, because there's a few other things distracting the news agenda. But also, let's get it right. Let's do it in the new year. Let's make that the start of the plan we have to change Britain.
The relaunch.
Well, I wouldn't call it a relaunch. 2022 is the year of fresh start.
Well, yes, and that's what Boris Johnson will be hoping to do, won't he? But the question is whether he can. I mean, do your colleagues in the Northern Research Group feel betrayed by the way so many homes are left without power for well over a week? I mean, if that happened in the southeast in Kent, there would be national outcry and there'd be a massive ministerial priority. It appears not to have been at the top of the in-tray of some ministers.
Doesn't that tell us why we need this levelling up agenda? Because you're absolutely right. All governments, are slightly sort of myopic or tin-eared when it comes to things facing people in the North. I actually think the journalists are to blame, Chris. Sorry. But, more of the, if this was happening in Surrey Heath or Marlow or somewhere and all the journalists were unable to turn their laptops on because they didn't have power, it would be the greatest national crisis. Places like Northumberland and, in the northeast up in County Durham, which have been without power for a week or two, they're just quite a long way away from the Whitehall machine. And that's why I believe that if the levelling up white paper is going to succeed, we need to build a new Britain that is more federalised, with power exercised by people outside London. We need a new deal on things like the NHS, which is absolutely in desperate need of reform. And, we need to try and change Britain for the better.
You're one of the three amigos who was around Boris Johnson after he quit as Foreign Secretary. How about you going back in number 10, being that person who can crack the whip, but also can tell the PM the truths he needs to hear sometimes?
Well, it's not a decision for me, but what I would say is we were called the Three Amigos. I was always very disappointed we didn't get a hat or a costume to wear in that role. Look, if Boris asked me to go back in and help him, I would help him because he's a mate. Look, I'm sure he has lots of people around him vying for that position who are far more qualified than me. So, I'm always available, but I don't expect the phone to ring anytime soon. I may be just getting a bit too forthright in my views and a bit too rebellious to walk back through the door.
I should say the other two amigos were Nigel Adams, now in the government, and Conor Burns, also now in the government. So you're the odd amigo out, Jake Berry. But just finally, do you think there's a chance that Boris Johnson might just wake up and think, I can't be bothered? He is a different leader to any leader we've ever known since Churchill, and he might like that comparison. Do you think he might just think, is it worth it? I've got so many children now, I need to feed their mouths, I need to go and lots more money on the speaking circuit. get his job back at the Telegraph?
Well, I don't think for 1 second he'll do that. And I'll tell you why. He fundamentally believes in this vision to change Britain, which he calls levelling up, which I call the Northern Powerhouse, whatever we mean by it. That is what drives him. He is a very long way, I think he would freely admit, from making progress and delivering on that. And I don't think until he has seen that agenda through that he would even consider handing the reins of power over to someone else, and nor should he.
So he'll serve a second term if he wins the election?
Maybe he wants to go on and on and on, but I don't think for 1 second he won't serve his next term in full.
Jake Berry, the chairman of the Northern Research Group, an old friend of Boris Johnson, and of course a senior Tory MP now. Thanks for joining us this week on Choppers Politics.
Thanks, Chris. I just think you mean old Tory MP now.
Now, earlier this week, former Liberal Democrat leader and MP for Westminster and Lonsdale, Tim Farron, tweeted this scathing assessment of the Christmas party revelations emerging from 10 Downing Street. It's worth hearing in full. Tim Farron said, "I'm desperate for our leaders to have integrity. I'm even more desperate that the electorate cares whether our leaders have integrity. This is the moment we discover whether the UK has become an appalling, irredeemable cesspit." And then he added, "If most of you don't care about this, then it has." Is that not over-egging the omelette slightly, Tim Farron?
I think I said that if people don't care, then it would demonstrate that we had become such a bloke.
Oh, right. There's an if in there, was there? Okay,
it's a bit of an if.
That, then.
I think, let's be honest, there's a bunch of things going on here. But first of all, that politicians behave badly is not new. Certainly since the 60s and the growth of mass media, the bad stuff we didn't know about, we now know about. And now we know about it 24/7 over the last sort of 10, 20 years. The problem is, what I think some politicians in the Western world, and I think our Prime Minister is one of them, have discovered more recently, is that when you're exposed for having done a wrong thing, there's a way through it. And it's basically not taking responsibility. Rely on the culture war, rely on your tribe to back you up no matter what, and tough it out. And after 4 or 5 days, everyone gets outrage fatigue and something else happens. And we all move on. I'm all for repentance and forgiveness and second and third and 23rd chances, but I also for people taking responsibility. And the best way of our politicians taking responsibility for stuff they've done wrong is the electorate caring enough to punish them if they don't do the right thing.
And that's not happening. And maybe that was a symptom of, let's use the B word, Brexit, that almost transcended normal politics, that the idea of delivering on that vote was more important than other stuff.
Well, I feel that, because what did Brexit do? It was an element of the culture war where you just backed your guy because your guy was on your side emotionally. And it's not just Brexit, by the way. I remember seeing a woman interviewed, I think on Newsnight actually, but a Texan woman, a really bright professional woman, in the run-up to the 2016 American presidential election. And she was being goaded really by, I think, Kirsty Walk about, why on earth you voted for Donald Trump. And Kirsty would go through the things that he'd done and said towards and about women. And this perfectly bright woman who was answering acknowledged all that. And I can't remember the exact words she said, but it was words to the effect of, look, if you're wanting to try and smash a window, you are not bothered about the moral integrity of the rock you throw through it. You just want it to be big enough to break the window. And the window to her was Hollywood, Washington liberalism, and Trump was the rock. And so that meant that he, and still, doesn't need to comply with the same rules of personal integrity.
And the same with Boris Johnson. So
to a degree,
if Brexit was actually about sovereignty, which it was for a lot of Brexiteers, not about everything else really. That's why it rode above all the other issues that were thrown at it, maybe.
Potentially, but it's like all nationalisms. And it's so I think that this will get lots of people upset here, but the coterminosity between being a Brexiteer and being a Scottish nationalist is enormous. Because in the end, it's all about taking back control. And I'm not saying emotional things are bad, by the way, but it's an emotional thing that overrides pragmatic things. And that, again, means it's all about team. The problem is this: whatever your allegiance to your nation, it doesn't trump your allegiance to your family. And listening to people in Cumbria in the last 24 hours and their reaction to what did or didn't, but almost certainly did happen in terms of parties in and around Downing Street, there's this great sense that I did not see my gran on her last Christmas, for example, or my auntie had to spend it on her own. The sense of the sacrifices that we as a family made, and those so-and-sos in London.
And what we saw in that mock press conference.
Absolutely, yeah, the thought of being laughed at as well. But the very fact that this is one rule for us and another rule for you, and that offends people in terms of their own personal experience, their family.
Do you think the leaders today are worse than they were maybe 20, 30 years ago? Or is it the case that the difference is the microscope is much stronger, the social media microscope?
Yeah, I think the latter mostly. I mean, there's lots of people. Churchill, Lloyd George would struggle to, bear the scrutiny of folks like you today, Chris. But I think the thing that's changed in the last 10 or 20 years, maybe actually more like 5 or 10, spin doctors and politicians have cottoned on to the fact that when you are exposed, you don't need to take responsibility. You can just tough it out, wait for the news cycle to move on, and all will be well. And it might well be well for you keeping your job, but it doesn't do anything to make politics in any way.
That's what they try and do, isn't it? But had they admitted 10 days ago that there had been a party amongst junior staff at Number 10, no ministers were there, it happened a year ago, and we're not impressed, we're taking disciplinary action, nothing to see here, it would have been a one-day story. But because they failed to do that, it is a story 10 years later which now threatens to overshadow attempts to restrict this country's movements. So yes, what you're saying is right, but it doesn't work.
Sometimes it works, but there's lots of... I'm going to argue that Priti Patel in any other job and in any other era, having been found guilty of bullying members of staff in her department, she'd have been out on her ear. But there was no question about this, gone. Robert Jenrick and the situation with Richard Desmond, likewise. I know
there are individual defences on both cases. I mean, the Tories would say that she's trying to reform the blob of the Home Office and people don't like being given some direct orders, and the Jenrick issue was one of a seating plan that went awry. There are defences on these.
They're not very good defences. And I think, and again, they're not defences that Margaret Thatcher would have tolerated. You'd have been out on your ear and, you may have had a comeback 5 years later, but you would not have been in your job more than 5 minutes. Your resignation would be expected, or you would have been sacked. And so I think it does. The sad reality is that there are people still in place, who prove that I'm afraid that toughing it out does work. The problem is, I think, what is beginning to come back to bite this government, if dishonesty is sewn into your operation and into your just way of being, then it's the first place you go to. And actually, as you rightly say, Chris, if they'd been honest right at the beginning, it would have been a mini scandal. There would have probably been resignations from members of staff. Ministers could have been angry about it, and it would have been a 1-2 day story. Labour would have tried to make something out of it, but it probably wouldn't have landed that much. The issue now is the cover-up of the cover-up of the cover-up, and that's because that's the instinct of this government. And actually, to be honest with you, not only is it morally right to be open, it tends to work. It tends to be the case that a genuine act of repentance is a thing that, generally speaking, is disarming to the electorate. And
like you saw with the video by Allegra Stratton. I mean, saying sorry is very compelling. Okay, you are sorry.
And I don't think there are many people now who think that she was the problem. And I think the impact is not I've been caught, it's that this has upset and hurt people. And I think she got that. She showed more emotional intelligence in 1 minute outside her house than the entire cabinet has done for the last 2 years.
Is it a Tory problem, do you think? Is it a problem because they've been in power for 11 years, or be sharing for 5 years with the Lib Dems, or is it across politics? We are seeing difficult behaviour across all parties, aren't we, most of the time?
So I take the view. So as a Christian in politics, part of my mission is to try to not treat other people who are in a different tribe as though they're somehow less than me.
They aren't scum, to misquote Angela Rayner.
Precisely. I appreciate passion, but they're not scum. Okay, they're or at least if they are, they're no more scum than I am. and so the danger is also that we then become all soppily neutral. So when things like this happen, it's important not to. It's not just a defence as a Liberal Democrat, but it's not right to say, oh well, we're all bad. Well, we are, but we're not all as bad. And I think that, so this is a peculiarly Tory problem. There is obviously failings in every party. We saw things in New Labour that were, they were very clever at media management, and very often that did not involve being all that familiar with the truth. But I think there is something much deeper. I'm not saying it's a right-wing problem, but I think it is a Tory problem. And I think it's also a problem it's a nationalism problem. Because if you can hide behind flag and bluster Same with Nicola Sturgeon. I mean, the record of the SNP in government in Scotland is utterly, utterly abysmal. And yet they get away with it because you just hide behind the saltire. But after a while, that does wear off. It's not worn off for Nicola yet. It will. It's wearing off for Boris because people see, hang about, you're trying to, cover up things by appeals to boosterism and patriotism. In the end, you did something or you lied about something which is enormously painful to me and my family. And that's where you find where people's real identity lies, and that is within the family group.
So just finally, Tim Farron, big question then. As Keir Starmer put it in PMQs this week, does Boris Johnson have the moral authority to lead this country?
I don't think he does, and I do not think in my 16 and a half years as an MP have I ever called for a Prime Minister to resign. I don't think so. But yes, I think Boris Johnson should go. I do, for two reasons. One is there's the justice issue that having misled, I think, the country and been responsible for setting rules that were life-saving rules and then not abiding by him or his team not abiding by them themselves. But secondly is a practicality issue. Whatever happens next, then the voice of the head of government has to be trusted and believed by the people out there. The reality is lots of people who are by no means vaccine deniers or COVID deniers and who've been quite obedient to this point are saying to me, I will not do a single thing that man tells me now. Now, that might be wrong, but the reality is I don't think he has the authority to actually lead the country at this time now, and for the good of the country, I think he needs to go.
Well, Tim Farron, Lib Dem MP, former Lib Dem leader, thank you for joining us this week on Choppers Politics. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks for having me. Cheers, Chris.
Well, that's all for this week, listeners. I'm willing to bet that a few of you have some pretty strong feelings about the new COVID restrictions coming in over the next few days and this Christmas party debacle. So please do share your thoughts, feelings and angry all-cap rants by emailing us chopperspolitics@telegraph.co.uk, or you can tweet us. We're at chopperspodcast. Thank you to my guests, Wragg MP, Jake Berry MP and Tim Farron MP. Thank you to my producers, Giles Gear, Louisa Wells and Theo Luludis. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. If you want more Chopper in your life, and I'll take it personally if you don't, you can sign up to my Choppers Politics newsletter, which delivers the inside track from Westminster every weekday to your email inbox. The link to sign up to that will be in the show notes to this episode. Plus, you can read my Peterborough Diary column, which brings all the insider gossip you need from the corridors of power every weekend. And finally, always buy a copy of the Daily Telegraph if you can. You won't regret it. Until next time, though, cheerio! Ho, ho, ho!